And if, like me, you'd never heard of APPG before, basically it's a grouping of politicians and industry that comes together and examines various things, particularly in this case in the built environment. And just about a year ago there was an inquiry into flooding, and a report was subsequently produced, which you can see in the picture there. There's a report on which has got the blue cover, Living with Water, and I've just put it next to the cover for the BRE white paper on flood resilience that we produced for Resilience15. The two of them have quite a lot in common, encouraging consideration of flood resilience and thinking in that direction. I've also copied a page which comes out of the PIT report, which was 2008 and followed the 2007 flooding. So Living with Water, or even the BRE publication, are not the first and probably won't be the last in this area. But how do we take them on? And that's part of what this session is about, is living with water, but also how do we take forward some of the recommendations in those reports, but generally address flood resilience and actually get it out there so that we go away from not just having conferences out, but we get greater implementation of flood resilience. So a little bit of background on the APPG report. It was based on oral and written evidence provided to the committee, and the committee, as I said, was of politicians and industry, and it was entirely voluntary whether you offered any evidence, written or otherwise. At the end of it, the report comes out with 16 recommendations, 11 which I would describe as being relevant to flood resilience. Leadership, about land, about debating the subject, so forums like this, but also forums that are out there at local level in the communities. About learning, maintenance came over strongly, retrofitting what we already have, but also creating good, robust, resilient design standards for what we're building next. Incentivizing resilience, so a little bit of the discussion we already had on insurers, or the incentivizing resilience, or what else can help us to do that. Promoting resilience, good practice demonstration, for example. Addressing most vulnerable sections of society, communities, but also upskilling the professionals, and I'm sure this is something we'll touch on in the session. There's 5 that were specific to sustainable drainage systems, around maintenance, public sewers, that they should address all developments, that we need robust, resilient standards, and we need to address the issue of adoption. So those are things that are in the report there. We won't restrict the discussion to that. We know there's resilience priorities. We know we need further research and innovation, but also going through to setting standards, certification for resilience, good practice demonstration, all that being necessary components. How could we take these recommendations in the APPG report, or indeed flood resilience generally, forward? We do have increasing awareness of what solutions can be, and we're increasing, as Dermot demonstrated, increasingly becoming sophisticated in the modelling and the identification of issues in terms of seeking solutions. We've got more technological innovation. We see some examples out there in on the display stand. And we've got a willingness and we've got an opportunity for different sections. We've heard that already today in the discussion. But we know that it can't be driven by more regulation or legislation at the moment. There's a resistance to that. And therefore we risk market failure. We've got a lack of resources, so we heard Mary Stevens talk about the comprehensive spending review and what they've been asked to model, whether that comes about or not. So we do have a lack of resources in both the public and private sector. So how do we do that? And we perhaps lack being joined up as well to deliver these recommendations. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, introduce Sue and Ian a bit further, and then we'll get into asking some questions. So, Sue is the director of Illman Young, a landscape practice based in Gloucestershire, and was president of the Landscape Institute from 2012 to 2014. Sue practice combined technical solutions with innovative designs and long-term interest in sustainable drainage, and that's a specialism in her practice. I think it's also fair to say you're the flood resilience champion of the Construction Industry Council, which is building on from the APPG report as well. And Ian is a geotechnical engineer, chartered geologist, with almost 30 years of industrial experience in geotechnical design, contracting, geosynthetic systems, etc. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Ian and Sue, not sure which order, and they're going to give us a few minutes before we have the Q&A.
Can you hear us on this okay? Okay, not too close, Ian, that's going to deafen everybody. Right, this is the document in question. Just with a show of hands, could I see how many have actually seen or read this document? Oh Lord, right, okay. Okay, so we can't...
You're all aware of it now.
Yes, there it is. So that's something I would strongly advise right away that you go and have a read of it. It's a very easy read. I'm complimenting Sue here because she was involved in writing it. It's an easy read, and particularly the recommendations section is pretty straightforward. I want to focus on a couple of aspects of it. You heard one of them earlier from me, which was the lack of implementation of Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act 2010. And if I just read a small section of this, where the report says, "We are extremely disappointed that Schedule 3, which set out the plans for SUD's implementation, maintenance and adoption, is not being implemented despite extensive backing from professionals and local authorities. Particularly disappointing is the dropping of plans for local authority-backed bodies, SUD's approval bodies, SABs as they're known. These would draw up standards and ensure that they were enforced and would be responsible for long-term maintenance. Instead, the government will drive the implementation of delivery of SUDs only through encouragement in the normal planning process." So basically, we're not going to get Schedule 3, we're not going to get the setting up of these SABs, and through that, we're not going to get the standards and the enforcement. We're not going to get the rules and the police, if you like. The reason I'm so concerned about that is that people in this room accepted it's not new technology, and the gentleman at the front mentioned that earlier this morning, but it's technology that's only known by a small percentage of the civil engineering, architectural, built environment population. Now, to my way of thinking, you need confidence to move these sort of initiatives forward. And that confidence comes from two places, or one of two places. You either have an in-depth knowledge of the subject, so you're perfectly comfortable with specifying it and designing and moving forward and constructing it, or you have a crutch to lean on. And that crutch is usually a set of standards written by somebody who does understand the subject, and you can go to those and you can specify with comfort, knowing that what's going to be constructed is going to work and is going to be able to be maintained and is going to be durable, etc., etc. We don't have either of those things at the moment. We don't have a well-trained professional or enough well-trained professionals to take the subject forward with a full understanding, and we don't have the right level of standards. Very briefly, the draft standards, which were drafted in December 2011, DEFRA draft standards, I'm holding in my hand here. Now, this is a document, I've printed it double-sided, but it's 12 pages, of which 8 pages are content. Now, it's not quite what it might be, but these were national standards, and the language in these standards were what would you expect from standards. The runoff must not be discharged, must not do this, you must not do this, you shall do that, etc. The standards we have now are covered on that piece of paper on rather large type. That is the 2 sides, approximately 600 words, that define the non-statutory technical standards for sustainable drainage. I'm interested in that phrase, non-statutory technical standards, for a start, because I'm not entirely sure what that means. To me, that reads guidelines. It's non-statutory, I don't need to pay any attention to it. And the language says the same. Picking out, there's a section here on volume, well, a section, that's probably overstating it. There's a couple of paragraphs on volume control. The first line is, where reasonably practicable. Who's going to decide that? If I decide it's not reasonably practical, do I just get to go and do something else? And you can read through, there's language all through this, but the rest of the language is based around, it shouldn't do this, and it should do that, and perhaps maybe might. That is not a set of technical standards as far as I'm concerned, and it's very worrying that we haven't got something that would allow professionals to lean upon them and drive the construction of SUDs forward the way that we would like. I have some personal experience of that, in that my real job that I get paid for is involved in supplying specialist construction products. A very small part of that is SUDS materials, but the variation in standard of materials that are offered up to sites is frightening. There's some very good materials produced by some companies that I could name but won't, and there's some shocking material by companies that I should name but won't. I get people, I'll give you a perfect example. Someone spoke to me the other day, and he was asking about a membrane for wrapping an attenuation system. And I said, right, so you'll need some tape for sealing that membrane. He said, no, I'm going to weld it. Well, you're not going to weld that membrane, because that membrane's like, glorified polythene, and you're going to have to tape it. No, it'll be fine, I've got some tape. And there we are. He's going off, he's bought the membrane, he's going off to do whatever he's going to do with it, and nobody's going to stop him, because there aren't regulations and standards to prevent him, and more importantly, perhaps, there aren't the police. Because if we didn't have speed cameras and policemen on the motorways, having a speed limit really wouldn't help us, would it? You need somebody saying, that's appropriate, that's not, and I'm checking on it. And as we stand at the moment, we don't have that. It's a bit of a shame that Mary's not still here, or maybe it's good that Mary's not still here. But when I questioned her about this, her advice was, afterwards, she said, why don't you just go with what we've got at the moment and let's try and make it work? And I was thoroughly disappointed with that. So I've said my little bit to begin with, and I'll pass you over to Sue.
Okay. Thanks very much to Stephen, really, for bringing forward us talking about the Living with Water report and what hopefully that will lead to. It was really quite unfortunate that the timing of that inquiry and the report fell really just at the change of government, and at the time it was whilst we were sitting and listening to evidence that the announcement came out that they were going to change what they were doing and do this complete U-turn. And of course this guidance that came out for April really was just after the report was, well, we knew it was coming out and that it was being published, so we were really stymied, but still felt the need to advocate for the fact of Schedule 3 being implemented. And I think it was really interesting, as I sat as one of the expert witnesses, to find that the parliamentarians were utterly horrified to learn about what the complete and utter muddle are, the way that we regulate and manage our water in this country actually is. Very encouraging that they were horrified. And although we did look at the whole issue of water from the catchment level down to the detailed level, as you will see if you look at it, that much of the focus and much of the evidence was around SUDS. So we are where we are. I think we all understand that, and whilst it may change, and I think the fact that I think there is still the potential for change, and I think the thing that I was interested to ask about Mary was, they're interested in how it's working in practice, but they're doing nothing to understand how it's working in practice. And the comment to me was, come to us with your evidence. Well, who in business makes big decisions about their business and then doesn't monitor the impact of investing or making change? The fact that we, as the practitioners, are now supposed to come forward with evidence from around the country to demonstrate what is and isn't working seems to me a rather strange way of going about it. Because I think the point about new build SUDS is that around the country it is being implemented in an extremely varied way. I think those authorities who were really gearing up to the full implementation of the Flood and Water Management Act, who had got their policies in place, who had got their supplementary planning documents in place, who'd got their sustainable drainage engineers in place, despite the fact that they've dismantled perhaps the personnel, still had a very good basis and understanding for how to move forward with this change. Those who were not as well organised or had not addressed these issues and were sort of really waiting until they were going to be forced or were, at different stages in their local planning system are still struggling. And therefore what we're now seeing is a great disparity across the country in the way that things are being addressed through planning applications. And that's making life very difficult for those who are in development, because actually they don't know the standards that they're going to have to work with. What will be acceptable to that authority? I mean, in theory, we know what the standards are, despite the fact that they may not be terribly practical, and will they be acceptable? But there are some absolute limits for certain aspects, but it doesn't give any guidance, and it certainly doesn't deal with adoption. And adoption was always the big stumbling point that we had in the past. And some authorities will adopt, or they'll only adopt certain things, some won't adopt certain things, and you've got to go through this massive learning curve for each local authority as to what they will and won't accept, what they will and won't adopt. And if you want to promote economic development, then what developers want is certainty above anything else. So perhaps that mantra of economic development was not such a great one. In terms of retrofitting, just very quickly to say that actually, when we look at the increasing incidence of flooding, there's only a limited amount that we can do by actually dealing with the issue of surface water from new development. The big issue is about retrofitting and the densification of our cities, regeneration sites. I mean, GLA, fantastic, 50% reduction. Clearly, one could do more. But generally speaking, that's not happening. Betterment is still the watchword in terms of redevelopment. So we need to do much more. Let's go back to greenfield runoff rates wherever we can, or just say that's what we're going to do for regeneration and redevelopment. But retrofitting, lots of good stuff, surface water management plans being developed, but where's the money to actually do it? Retrofitting is expensive, even if we align it with other outcomes, which we absolutely should do. So hopefully lots to talk about there.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take the privilege to ask a couple of questions of my fellow panellists here. First of all, I'll make a couple of comments. I think both Ian and Sue both talked about sustainable drainage systems quite a lot there. I would view a parallel with regards to buildings and making buildings more flood resilient, because we've both got to address what's coming tomorrow or next year in terms of new development. We've also got to address the existing stock of buildings that we have, and we know that there's things that can be done there, and we've come quite a way with regards to that. But in fact, when you look at it, out of 5 or 6 million properties that are at risk of flooding in the UK, there's probably about 20,000 of them now have had some form of flood resilience measures taken. So there's a big performance gap there, and I think it's not a discussion about whether you retrofit properties or you retrofit sustainable drainage systems. Both are part of the solution. But I'd like to just kind of ask a couple of questions. First of all, try and do this as quick fire as possible. APBG and reports now been taken forward by the Construction Industry Council through committee. So there's an initiative there to try to implement some of the recommendations or to take them forward. But we've heard that there's other initiatives on the go. Mary announced this morning that Pete Bonfield, the top floor man here in BRE, has been asked to chair a round table of high-level discussion about how to implement flood resilience. So, but he's also working on an initiative around energy efficiency. How do we get people to take up energy efficiency measures in greater numbers as well? So is there any way that we can somehow see some synergies between these initiatives, maybe learn from each other at a minimum level, or do we just have to plough our own furrow here? Also, Ian, I happened to notice you had an accent that was probably a bit further north than Watford here. And I just wondered, I know you've been down this neck of the woods for a while now, but whether, because a lot of the policy we're discussing here is based on England. Funnily enough, that's where we are. But are there other things that we can learn from other parts of the world, or maybe even other parts of the UK in terms of policy and practice?
I'll take that bit first.
Please do.
I live in Wokingham, by the way. There's clearly a Wokingham accent. Yes, I think, you're obviously alluding to the Scottish connection, Stephen. I think the point is things, in all areas, to be honest, of government, things tend to move a little bit quicker in Scotland, and that's not because we're smarter. I'm not saying whether we are or we aren't. I'm just saying it's not because we're smarter. It's simply because it's smaller, and there are less people involved. The communication lines are shorter. There are less people with their fingers in the pie, so decisions tend to get made quicker. And I think certainly that there's something to be looked at there as an example. I mean, if you look, and I was trying to find it, which was why I was flicking through, in one of the documents I've been reading recently, it shows you the list of people who are involved in managing the water in England, and it is utterly frightening. I mean, it's got more boxes than half the slides we saw this morning, and there's people all over the place with all these different considerations. So, to kind of answer the first question as well, I would sincerely hope that the group that we're involved with, the CIC, and the group that your colleagues involved in, could start a bit of a dialogue and get some of these things joined up, because we certainly need to be doing that. I've heard today, actually, to give an example, I've heard today that there's a British standard coming out for SUDS products. It astonishes me. I sit on the British Standard Committee for geotextiles and geomembranes, and we've not been consulted. Well, I'm glad you're shaking your head. Good, I'm glad that's not the case. Then somebody misquoted, because I panicked slightly. So maybe that's a bit of miscommunication that hasn't happened. But certainly I think that there is so much scope for some of these groups getting together and pulling in the same direction. Maybe not in the same direction as the government, but in the same direction. And I'm talking about this government, the UK British government. Got a hint there, perhaps.
Right, there's a lot of things in there, actually, Stephen. I mean, I think that it sounds like what Peter is dealing with is more about the property level, about individual homeowners. I think that through the CIC group is perhaps slightly more awkward to deal with, because I think that, but it is an area where it's been done so effectively abroad. I mean, particularly in America, where decisions about big water management schemes are being delivered with very large parts of that being done at the individual property level and being done by mobilising and working with communities, working through schools and neighbourhoods to actually retrofit houses by disconnecting their downpipes and actually using green systems. But that's combined with retrofitting in streets and businesses and green roofs and everything else that's happening there, and looking at new build. But, there's, the examples are endless. I mean, Fowler, I'm sure you're working on some of these things anyway, but Portland, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, you just name them, the list goes on and on and on. And these are all backed by the fact that, in many instances, those cities can't afford to spend the money to just do engineering. And actually what they want is the outcome and all the multifunctional benefits that go with building resilience, but also building resilience in terms of water security and all of the things we were talking about this morning as well. This is not a single issue. And the most important thing is that we take this into looking at all the other benefits that accrue, because then when you start to look at the money and you start to monetize the benefits that you're going to get, then these things are absolutely a no-brainer. So you would have thought that if we were talking economic development, if you wanted to start to monetize the benefits of the system, it would be such a simple thing to do. In terms of has it been done better elsewhere, then clearly in Scotland, through SEPA and through what's been happening there, they have been adopting schemes for a number of years, but they've only been adopting certain SUDS components, which has clearly caused a lot of problems in that it's very limited. They're trying to open it up, but it's been very slow. So I suppose they've had their own problems, but I think the point is they've demonstrated that it's possible to do it. I think there's also questions now about, the government said, well, we need to deal with maintenance, somebody needs to do it. So we've got some water companies now looking to adopt systems. But then everybody puts their own constraint on what they will adopt, because then it takes it out of the realm of being something that you know what you're dealing with that's going to be acceptable. So does that mean that we then have systems that are determined by what a water company wants to adopt? Question mark. So I think there's as many questions as answers, I think, in the system still. But I think if we could get into the American mentality of championing an uptake of things and the community engagement factor of how you have to work with communities at the grassroots levels to deliver particularly retrofitting, is just always severely underestimated. It's a fundamental part of what you do, because people must understand that this thing that grows plants outside their front door is critical infrastructure, and that needs looking after.
Okay, that's great. What I'm going to do is take 3 questions from the floor and then let Sue and Ian discuss them. But when I say questions, I don't mean a dissertation. So if you can keep them short and snappy, that would be great. We've got one at the back, one in the middle. I think we've got one at the front. We've maybe got 2 at the front, but we'll come back. Start at the back.
I just wondered why there's always so little attention and debate surrounding wider catchment level stuff, particularly ecosystem restoration and protection when we talk about flood resilience.
Catchment.
Great discussion about SUDS. Actually, is it a different question? How well is our planning system delivering safe communities?
Catchment to planning.
I just wondered what you thought to the government trying to move everything to a more local level, and whether that is a good thing, or because you talk about everything being in silos, is that making things more of a silo? And we all know that if you bulk buy, you get better discounts and stuff. So is it really better at a local level creating these more silos?
Thanks, Nigel. Quick addendum. Come on.
Given the lack of funding, I wonder if the flood resilience community is missing a trick, because Water UK, I quote, at a meeting September 2015 called by the UK government, Water Minister Rory Stewart and a member of invited water company chiefs were talking all about the problem of water availability, and particularly on whether there shouldn't be a link between both reports, in other words, using flood water and surplus water in the northwest for scarcity.
Okay, thanks. So we've got from catchment level to planning system. Does it really work at the local level, and water resources? Okay. Who wants to start?
Right, catchments, absolutely, very important, and they are talked about a lot. They were mentioned in the report, and we did discuss it, but somewhat briefly, because I think it was all about the fact that there was this potential legislation change that was happening. So it was very much of the moment. I think there is some really, really good work that's been going on in terms of catchment management and integrated water management, looking at different interventions down the catchment. And so there are particular areas where they've done really good work. So up in Yorkshire, what they're doing in the peat bog restorations, there's really good work working down in the southwest. I know there's some good studies over in Hertfordshire and I think Cambridgeshire. So I think there's a lot of knowledge and there is a lot of understanding and there's lots of small scale initiatives. The problem is that in any catchment you need an awful lot of them to actually make a big impact, because also what we're talking about is some of these are very small scale. They might be about grassing margins of rivers, about tree planting, about all sorts of things, at the low level intervention. So I think there is a lot of discussion, there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of work that has been done and it's moving on, it is really good. But it's slow to have an impact, and there's quite a lot of studies monitoring what's happening. So don't think because it's not headlines, it's not on the agenda, it's absolutely on the agenda. Planning, is it working? I mean, the thing I find really, really worrying, I mean, I do a lot of voluntary work with Syria, and part of what they do through Sustrain is they often have sessions with local authorities where you get a room full of local authorities and people talking about a certain subject. And there was one a couple of months ago where we had some of the good local authorities talking about what they're doing to help the not so up to speed local authorities get knowledge. And when those were saying, the planners sitting there saying, well, it's another factor in the planning balance. That is scary, scary, scary stuff. Because, this should not be, well, let's trade it off. Do we want a few more books in the library or do we want some suds? That's planning balance for you. So that is very, very worrying. And that's also coming from authorities who do have good policies and who do have good SPDs. And I think all that and people like Syria are doing is working with local authorities to actually give them and help them to develop the tools that they need. But at the end of the day, they're on their own when it comes to how they manage every planning application that drops through their inbox as to how they actually handle that. And I really do find that quite worrying as to where we're going with that, because what we're likely to be doing is maybe making the situation worse in the long term, but not in the short term. So, local level, all that. I don't quite know how to answer that one.
Well, this is what I was looking for earlier. It's a quotation in the document that in the UK, the water management in the UK is complicated by the fact we have what has been described as, inverted commas, the most disconnected water management system in the world, which is not a really good position to start from. But I think it's interesting because I wonder if in the short term we might gain more by local organisation, but in the longer term, going back to my regulation hobby horse, in the longer term we need the same rules across the country so that everybody knows what they're doing and we gain confidence, which brings us on to the adoption point. People aren't going to adopt things if they're not confident about what they're getting and what the maintenance is involved and what they're committing to. And somehow we've got to build that confidence. And I think weak regulations don't bring that confidence, but I've brought that back around to my own topic again. So I think that silos one is interesting. You could probably, like most situations, you could probably achieve more in the short term by working locally. Planning, I'm going to leave to Sue because I'm not a planner. The wider catchment, a lot of that stuff is there's a lot of talk in the literature, there's a lot of talk across the board about looking at wider catchment, and so much of it makes sense because you could do things in areas which are a lot less sensitive, where you're not in the middle of a city, you're not having to build big ugly walls, excuse me anyone who makes walls over there in the corner. You could do things that would make a big difference to the fluvial flooding, but if you're talking about local surface flooding, is that necessarily going to help in the city centre? So, but I do think there's a lot more could be done further out and relatively easily to improve that situation.
I think in terms of what you're saying about the local situation, what we need is, I think that, we said it, leadership in government, and we need some simple policy that says this is that you must, because there is so much that won't happen unless you've got that you must. And therefore the problem that we get with trying to deal with it now is it allows people to now sit in their silos of, well, we've got a highways engineer perhaps who might not want to have these sorts of things happening or doesn't want to adopt stuff. And absolutely it is a big problem. There are local authorities who will not adopt permeable paving. They just say no. And they can just say no, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what you would then get is, where we were before, is as long as it was recognised as being what is, something that was agreed as an appropriate SUD system, they would have to adopt it. There was no, I don't want it, I don't like it, I don't want one of them, thank you very much. You would have had to do it. So, and the guidance on SUDs, I should just put a plug in now for the fact that the new SUDs manual is being launched next week, and it really does address more than just dealing with drainage water. It is much more looking at the big picture and how we actually do, of course, think about all of our water, because you've got a resource, why are you not using it most effectively? So,
what I'm trying to make was that the government seemed to be already worried about the shortage of water,
yes.
particularly in the southeast.
And talking about desalination plants when we've got flooding. I mean,
So it might be a leverage for money if you look at the two.
Yeah, I mean, but we do have a problem that the shortage of water is in the southeast and the excess of water tends not to be.
Well, it joins up with your point about local concerns. I never had to water my grass in Glasgow, funnily enough. In fact, I struggled to get it to be dry enough to cut it. Whereas in Wokingham, I have to water it all summer. We haven't had a hosepipe ban this summer, but they were. When you moved into a new house, I had to water it all day. But out of my water butt that was provided with my new house, I might point out. So I was watering it with rainwater. But didn't have to do that in Glasgow, so the rules may have to be locally relevant. Things you don't have to worry about in the west of Scotland, you do in the southeast of England.
Indeed. I think just to come back to the local issue, if your house is flooded, it's your responsibility. So you can get very local about it. But I think there is a potential, and we'll probably hear from Paul later on, for communities to come together to help themselves. But they also need assistance, I think, as well from local authorities and other authorities as well to implement some of these things, because otherwise there's a lack of information, a lack of standards that they're up against. It's not buying a household good, it's something quite different. So, what we're going, right, still got time. We're going to take two more questions, the same again, quick fire round. I've got two hands straight away, so I'm going to take those. Start over here.
Hi, thank you. Steve Hodgson, Property Care Association. It's a bit of a mean question, but do you think governments have form for both seeding industries and then stuffing them up? I use both the property level flood protection industry, but the best example of it at the moment is the retrofit insulation industry, which are probably, if you look really carefully at the numbers, losing more individuals through redundancy than even the steel industry at the moment, because the grants have run out. So it all comes crashing down. So in many respects, good for the government and its deliberations and its interventions, a force for good or a force for evil, or both.
Richard Look, Bureau Happold. I'm just wondering, we've got quite a few agendas running here about planning standards, enforcement, pushing things down to a local level. We'll come to community resilience and the public sector role in that and greasing the wheels for that to happen. How do we keep these agendas resourced when councils and central government are cutting by 20 to 45%, as we heard earlier?
Very last one.
Maria Mimani from Anglia Ruskin University. Today we discussed a lot about resilience, but how far can we go with resilience? How far should we go with resilience? Is there any kind of level of resilience we should get? Is it a destination we should get, or is it a kind of idea of it's a journey and there is not any level of resilience. I guess that can clarifying this, I guess, can help a lot in regulation of that kind of level of resilience. And I guess Ofwat has discussed, not very much, but in one of the reports I read somewhere that they discussed about the level of resilience, just moving away from this level of risk, acceptable risk kind of things towards more level of resilience.
Resilience journey, how far can we get? Okay, resilience journey, how far can we get, especially if the government puts the stop on some of these initiatives?
Michael,
Okay.
be polite, like you go, and I might have to say so much as well. Government, yes. Now, I suppose we could use the excuse and say there was an election in between us getting drawn into this and then the decision being made, but the cynical amongst us might say that might have happened anyway, whether the government had changed or not. I can only say I was extremely disappointed that things did not get carried through and don't appear to be getting carried through in the way that most of us, I'm assuming, would like, and I'm going to ask a question about that in a moment. Resources, we'll go back to my hobby horse again, you see, if we had standards and regulations, it'd be a lot easier because we wouldn't have to have quite so many well-qualified people because they'd have something to rely on and something to support them. But that's, given in a situation where we're trying to cut costs, that's the only easy solution I can see to that problem, that you provide people with more support. So given that we're not going to change that immediately, I think things like the manual, there's plenty of information from Syria, there's plenty of resources from elsewhere. I think we all have to keep encouraging as many people as we can to keep up to speed with that and maintain standards and do things properly so that it builds this word confidence again. How far should we go with resilience? Is that the tough luck question? I don't know really. I just don't know the answer to that in all honesty, but it's a good question.
Maybe that's the challenge of the government as well.
Heaven help us. Yeah, I think that's correct, but unfortunately there's certain poor people have been put in positions or bought houses in places that maybe they should never have built houses, but we have to help those people somehow, or gradually move them away from there. Or that's what these guys at the back come in with the retrofit measures.
Okay. Well, all I can say is, I mean, that you're saying about people being built up by government funding and grants and then getting dumped. I mean, that's just happened to the people in the solar industry. I know landscape practices who had whole divisions working on getting permissions for solar farms. It stopped overnight, and that industry is also completely downscaled. When you come to the water industry, I would say it's continued on an upward trajectory and has been for quite a long time. And in the Water White Paper, it was all talking about developing the green industry, supporting that as well, which was a really important aspect. And the thing is that it has continued to develop, because I suppose the good news amongst all this that sounds like really bad news is that actually there is a huge amount of work happening on the ground, because enough people were geared up to thinking that something was going to happen, and clearly we were needing to deal with suds and retrofitting anyway. So the industry has developed and people are getting the expertise, and the industry is continuing to expand because more schemes are being implemented despite the fact that we're not being aided by government. So I think that...
If I may add, that may be true for SUDS, and I work with a local planning group as well, there where I live, and that's certainly the case of a lot of developments we're seeing. What I was really referring to is the smaller scale property level flood resilience and resistance measures that have been seeded enormously by the repair and recovery grants from 2013. They stop. Everything stops. A lot of the flow of work then gives up. And a lot of these guys, we keep pointing to these poor fellows at the back of the room, but these guys actually then are dissuaded from investing in the long-term future of the development of their products and their businesses because they see such deep peaks and troughs in the flow of the funding that comes from government. And I do agree entirely with the whole issue of improving standards. If consumers trust what they're going to get, then they're likely to buy. But the fact is that these peaks and troughs created by artificial markets of the government actually deliver good times, but they also deliver very, very hard times too.
I mean, I think that what you see is that, like after Somerset, there was funding in that area for resilience through the local council. So that was, it wasn't a massive peak because it was a relatively small number of people that were affected ultimately. But people didn't necessarily even take it up, even though money was on offer in terms of building resilience. I don't think you'll get around that, but resilience is very much also a measure in terms of retrofitting. I mean, most of the retrofitting work I do is not about property level at all, other than actually disconnecting downpipes. It's not actually working with the building fabric, which is most of what you're talking about, I would imagine. So I think there will be, because, you know, this isn't going away. You know, and each year there are floods all around the country regularly, but we're not hearing them because they're not the great big ones. I mean, I'm working in Glasgow, and we did community engagement a couple of weeks ago, and the guys were saying, I've been flooded 3 times this year already, but that may have only affected 40 properties, and the neighbours 3 streets away didn't even know it had happened. So just remember, there's a lot of, there's a lot of flooding. There's been flooding in England, Wales and Scotland this year. It probably didn't make the headlines other than locally, but it is happening.
I want to just ask 2 quick questions, very unscientific survey, but just by show of hands, how many people in the room know what I'm talking about when I talk about Schedule 3 of the Flood Water Management Act? So what's that? It's about 60%. How many of those people would rather it had been implemented? About pretty much the same number, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Damn shame she's not here to see that, but there we are. That would make a lot of difference. Okay.
And the SUDS journey, can I just say about that, actually, there isn't an end to it. You know, I mean, I think that no matter what we do, there's not a goal that we're going to get at. There's something that we're aspiring to head towards. And no matter, this is a very rocky journey, I would suggest, because, it is a big problem, and as we're improving our resilience, the problem is getting worse. So we're really running to try and catch up the whole time, and even keep the problem where it is today. Don't think that there's a "we've solved it" scenario, because unfortunately, I don't think there is a "we've solved it." All I think we can hope for is that we can keep managing it to the best that we can. Because ultimately, there'll always be another storm that will happen that we haven't predicted, I think.
Okay, thank you. Okay, very quick.
Do you think the whole SUDS agenda would benefit from a rebranding of what SUDS actually are? I mean, you get proposals which are piped on, piped break, and that's considered by many applicants as an exemplar of SUDS scheme. And I just wonder if this whole attenuating oversized pipes and things like that, whether we even mix up what actually SUDS are, going back to the natural catchment wide drainage approach.
Very quickly, rebranding SUDS.
Well, very quickly, I think the point was made here that linking it in with the whole water cycle and how we manage water would help a great deal. It is farcical that we have droughts and we're sitting here talking about flooding, and we're not discussing both. There'll be other items. We're not discussing the whole subject.
And I think also it's horses for courses. It's not either or. It's both together and what's most appropriate. I just think it's unfortunate that people have been very lazy and just saying I can do a quick calculation and stick it in a sock and grade tank in the ground, without actually thinking that from their client's point of view it could have been an awful lot cheaper if they thought about it differently. But in a very dense urban environment, sometimes that might be the only answer. It might be.
Okay, thanks so much. We've come to the end of our time there, unfortunately, because it was excellent debate, excellent questions that came up. I think what I would say for people who haven't had a look at this report yet, please do so. And I think if you're interested in getting involved in it in some way, there's an opportunity to do that through CIC, and we'll find a way. So, Steve, if you can find an extra day in the month, I'm sure you can get involved in that, because the point you make is very good, and somehow this initiative and the what I'll call the Peter Bonfield initiative around flooding need to look to decouple reliance of the the flood resilience sector from these peaks and troughs of government money. Okay, so we're going to stop there. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break. So if you can come back for 4 o'clock, I'll get in the bad books with my colleagues if I don't ask you to fill in the feedback form, which there are copies on your tables, and if you just leave them lying there afterwards, that would be great. So can you help me thank the speakers again in the traditional way?